Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about Russian migration to Great Britain in the 20th century, a century marked by revolutions, wars, exiles, and remarkable human stories. Let's start with the numbers. The 1901 census recorded around 65,000 people living in Britain who had been born in Russia. But here's the curious thing, when examining the database, only 7 people named Ivan could be found. Most names were of other origins: Abraham, Fanny, Henry, and so on. In other words, most of those listed weren't ethnic Russians at all, but came from across the multi ethnic Russian Empire: Jews, Poles, Balts, Finns, and others. The same census listed 95 people who identified Ukraine as their place of birth, again mostly with non Slavic names. By the 1911 census, the number of people born in Russia had risen to over 73,000. However, many of these were likely Britons born in Russia to expatriate families involved in trade or industrial ventures in cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Arkhangelsk, later returning home. Then came the revolution of 1917, which changed everything overnight. With the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and the collapse of the Russian monarchy, Britain abruptly cut diplomatic and trade ties with Russia. The new Bolshevik government renounced all Tsarist debt, and Britain in turn supported the anti-Bolshevik forces during the Civil War. Through the northern port of Arkhangelsk, Britain helped evacuate around 12,000 people, soldiers, officers, and civilians, to British territory. It was one of the largest and quickest refugee evacuation of the early 20th century. By the 1921 census, there were 28,000 Russians and 9,000 Ukrainians in Britain. Yet again, many names were English in origin, likely descendants of Britons who had once lived and worked in the Russian Empire and had now come back. The precise number of Russians in Great Britain at the start of the 20th century is, of course, difficult to determine. Sources vary widely, ranging from 3,000 to 300,000, depending on who was counting and how. According to the Russian Consulate General in London, the number was around 15,000. The American Relief Administration in a 1921 report also cited 15,000 Russian refugees living in Great Britain at the time. By then, Britain had already become the first Western country to resume trade relations with the new Soviet government, which left many Russian refugees in an awkward position. The UK formally recognized the USSR on 1st of February 1924, and from that point, the number of Russian refugees began to decline again through onward migration, naturalization, or in some cases, return. According to the Nansen organization, by 1930, only about 4,000 Russians remained in England. Language too played a part. Unlike in France, where the Russian immigration community was large enough for people to live without knowing French, in Britain the lack of sizable Russian-speaking environment made its adaptation far harder. Under the leadership of the director of the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University of London was founded in 1930 to promote cultural understanding between the two nations. But long before that, many exiles were politically active. In 1919, the Committee for the Liberation of Russia was created. It was financed by wealthy immigrants, Admiral Kolchak's government, and the armed force of southern Russia. Its main task was to spread information about events in Russia within Britain, from bulletins for members of parliament to press articles and brochures such as The Spirit of the Russian Revolution. For this purpose, a full media headquarters were established on Fleet Street, in the very heart of British journalism. Among publications circulating at the time were the London Reference Sheet and Russian Life, the latter appearing after the earlier magazine New Russia was closed. Alongside political activism, cultural activity occupied its own important place. The Circle of Russian Art and other societies devoted to maintaining Russian intellectual life abroad. Adapting to a new country was immensely difficult, particularly for those who fled involuntarily. Employment was a major obstacle. Various societies emerged to help the immigrants. The Russian-British Brotherhood, the Red Cross, and Zemgor, and the Russian embassy under Sablin, which continued to assist compatriots until 1924. After Britain recognized the Soviet Union, Sablin purchased a mansion in Kensington, which became known as the Russian House. From 1924 until the Second World War, Sablin lived there, turning it into a cultural and social hub. Sablin's Russian House at 32 Kensington Palace Gardens later became part of the French Institute's cultural offices. Other charitable organizations included the Russian Relief Fund, the Society for Assistance to Russian Refugees in England, the Ladies' Circle for Aid to the Russian Red Cross, the Children's Aid Committee, and a charitable department within the Russian National Committee. There was even a ladies' sewing department producing clothing to be sent to northwestern Russia. Emigrants formed associations according to their background or interests, societies of northerners, mutual aid groups for officers, and so on. Overall, these organizations focused either on helping Russians, refugees inside Britain, or supporting the White Army abroad. Because there were so many organizations, often with overlapping missions, attempts were made in 1919 to coordinate their work. But those efforts largely failed, as different groups competed for funding, influence, and recognition. Interestingly, the same issue exists today. Dozens of small and large initiatives in Britain, both funded and volunteer-based, aim to help migrants integrate and access information, yet coordination is still a challenge. Back in 1919, the outcome of that coordination attempt was to hold two separate meetings, one for organizations aiding Russian refugees in Britain and another for those providing aid to Russians abroad. If necessary, joint meetings could be convened. A resolution from this meeting was published in March 1920 in New Russia and the Times. In June 1920, a major step was taken, the creation of the main committee for the affairs of all Russian refugees headquartered in London. The aims were threefold: to centralize financing, to create an authorized representative body for Russians, to coordinate employment assistance. The committee gave priority to the most vulnerable women, people with disabilities, and the elderly, while allowing participating organizations to retain full autonomy. Later, Russian emigrants joined the London Public Committee to help famine victims in 1921-1922, while the Red Cross offered medical care, children's camps, and holiday events for displaced families. The development of Russian culture and education in Britain was led by Zemgor, the Russian Economic Society, the Russian Academic Union, the Union of Russian Artists, and similar bodies. There were even associations of teachers, engineers, guitarists, and musicians, as well as concert organizing committees. Members of British society often joined too. By the end of 1919, the Russian-British Brotherhood had about 150 members, including around 20 Britons. In 1922, following a conference chaired by Nansen, the League of Nations introduced a special travel document for stateless refugees, the Nansen Passport. It was valid for 1 year and renewable as needed. If the holder returned to the USSR, the passport became invalid. However, Britain only began recognizing Nansen passports officially in 1937. Obtaining visas and work permits in Britain was extremely difficult. Even with a visa, refugees couldn't take up employment without special authorization. Employers needed permission from the Ministry of Labour to hire foreigners for a specific post and duration. Until that approval was granted, a foreign applicant couldn't even enter the country. From 1933, some refugees were allowed to enter without the right to work, a policy that many might find familiar even today. Many migrants suffered a crisis of identity, a feeling of having lost their homeland and nationality. When the Soviet Union invalidated Tsarist passports, many exiles effectively became stateless or denationalized. To maintain a sense of cultural continuity, the Russian community abroad began celebrating Pushkin's birthday as Russian Culture Day. first marked in 1925. Cultural life thrived through concerts, musical circles, literature evenings, and cabarets. The great Ferda Shalapin toured Britain, drawing enormous crowds. According to some records, by 1931, more than 9,000 Russians had been naturalized in the UK. During the Second World War, relations between Britain and the Soviet Union went through several stages, from suspicion to alliance. There were tensions over intelligence operations, but in 1941, the two countries signed military agreements in Iran, and in May 1942, they concluded a 20-year Treaty of Mutual Assistance. That same year, Winston Churchill travelled to Moscow to meet Joseph Stalin for the first time. In 1944, Sublin's Russian house in London was destroyed by bombing. It was later rebuilt. But after Sublin's death in 1949, it ceased to exist as a community centre. Because so many refugees represented the best part of this society, they made significant contributions to British science and culture. Babkin, one of Pavlov's students, was honoured by a Royal Society for his research on this physiology of high nervous activity. Another studied reflexes, digestion, and blood circulation, earning awards from the President of the British Physiological Society. Korinchevsky founded the Club of Aging, later renamed the British Society for Research on Aging, laying the groundwork for modern gerontology. A remarkable example is Lord Uvarov. Born in Uralsk, he fled Russia in 1921 and was hired at the Entomological Bureau in London. Just 8 years later, he founded the International Centre for the Study of Locusts, which he directed for 14 years. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society and in 1961 was granted a peerage. The story of Petr Kapitsa was more bittersweet. Stranded in Scotland at the outbreak of the First World War, he spent 13 years in Britain and became director of a Cambridge laboratory in 1933. But when he returned briefly to Leningrad in 1934 to visit his family and attend a congress, he was ordered by Soviet authorities to stay permanently in the USSR. In total, many Russian scientists became fellows of the Royal Society, showing that despite adversity, immigrants could integrate and achieve remarkable success in Britain. And as always, one of the greatest challenges remained language, the key to true integration in any society. After 1945, relations between the Soviet Union and Britain rapidly deteriorated, entering the Cold War, a period marked by espionage, propaganda, and suspicion. The atmosphere affected the Russian community in Britain as well. The presence of Soviet agents and informants undermined trust among the immigration community, making their networks more cautious and fragmented than those of other exile groups. According to the 1951 census, there were 76,000 people in Britain who had been born in Russia. By 1961, that number had dropped to 53,000 due to naturalization, onward migration, and the lack of large-scale immigration from the USSR. A new wave of immigration would not begin until the late 1980s during Perestroika. And that's everything I wanted to share in this video. If you found this look into 20th century Russian migration to Britain interesting, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.